Our first respondent is Jim Baller. He is the president of Baller Stokes and Lead, which is a law firm here in Washington and in Minneapolis. They represent telecom companies and municipalities around the country. He's also been the founder of the Coalition for Local Internet Choice, working with a number of cities that are deploying their own broadband, and he formed the U.S. Broadband Coalition, more than 160 different organizations, all working together to promote broadband around the world, around the country. So over to you, and again, I hope we will have questions at the end of the three speakers.
Thank you. First of all, could I get some help with time? I have 8 minutes, and I would be grateful if someone waved at me at about 6. You'll do that? Okay, I see. All right. I've been a friend and admirer of Blair's work for many years, and over the years I've seen his papers and presentations always filled with a broad range of historical and current information, as well as trenchant insights and policy observations. I'm going to be commenting not just on what Blair said today, but on some of the major points in the backgrounder that he has given, because I tend to agree with almost everything that Blair has said, but I see the world through slightly different eyes. My perspective is one that, from the perspective of one who works primarily with local governments in their capacity as trustees of public rights-of-way and assets, and also as providers or facilitators of affordable, ubiquitous access to high-capacity broadband. And most of you know this has been a year in which there's been a great deal of attention and interest among local governments and others on developing or getting access to gigabit networks. And I'd like to start by explaining why that's the case, because this is critically important as a backdrop to what I'm going to say later. Think of what local governments have considered important for decades, for centuries, time immemorial: economic development, education, healthcare, transportation, energy, environmental concerns, and on and on. All of these areas today can be driven, supported, and facilitated simultaneously over advanced communications networks, all of them at the same time. And we know that the world is rapidly developing in all of these areas. Like there was a big bang, and progress is happening in all of those areas, and communities need access to the networks in order to get the benefits of that progress. So that's how I see the world. And so when I hear that Blair's central thought here today is that the highest priority for broadband competition policy ought to be to lower input costs for adjacent market competition and network upgrades, my personal reaction is that it is and should be a priority, but it shouldn't be the only one, and it isn't necessarily, at least to me, the highest priority. Now, Blair does not claim that it ought to be the only one, and he, in fact, in his paper does underscore several of the things that I will talk about, but that it's on that level that we disagree. And when Blair talks about cable competing with telco, competing with wireless, competing with over-the-top users, I can see those from a high policy level, but the world I see primarily is down at the project level, and it isn't cable competing with telco in a grand scheme. At the project level, the adjacent markets are competitors and make entry more difficult. So as wireless, for example, moves from what it originally was, basically BlackBerries, to 3G, 4G, and wherever it goes, it makes it more difficult for competitors to enter the market and succeed. This does not necessarily mean that fiber and wireless are head-to-head competitors in a major way, but if you're looking at the take rates you need from the market and you lose a group here that's satisfied with the cable company's offering and you lose another portion to wireless, pretty soon you have a challenging business case, a more challenging business case, and you need to find other ways to be successful by driving more deeply into healthcare applications, educational applications, and other substitutes than you might have done before. And so, this should certainly, to me, not be the only priority, given what the goals of local governments are, but we should also be doing other things that are critically important. We should remove barriers, state laws and other kinds of barriers that deter or prevent local governments from participating in their markets, either as providers of service or partners in public-private partnerships, which are expanding greatly across the country now. Facilitating access to rights-of-way, that's happening all across the country, but it's very complicated, more complicated than you might think. Someone with, let's say, Google coming into the market, a community may be very eager to enter into arrangements that work for Google, but non-discrimination requirements would require them to bestow similar benefits to others. Are others similarly situated? We might say no, they will certainly say yes. So a decision to provide a benefit here might have implications that are much more significant across the board than might immediately seem present. Access to apartment buildings and other what we call multiple dwelling unit buildings. These can be 25, 35, 40% of some urban markets, and if an incumbent has tied them up in a gauntlet of exclusivities, a new entrant can effectively be unsuccessful before even laying the first foot of fiber in the community. So we need to be aware of that. We need to look at the legal constraints around access to MDUs. Content. We currently have multiple barriers in getting access to content through a very complex retransmission consent regime, through programming access rules and others. Those need to be fixed. Incumbents often engage in behaviors that from the outside looking in sometimes appear to be predatory, sometimes at the very least reflect targeted rate discrimination. There used to be rules that dealt effectively with those situations. We need to think about restoring them. The Broadband Opportunity Council at the federal level has just conducted a process of getting 25 departments of federal government to look into themselves and see what they are currently capable of doing to be more supportive of broadband. Thank you. And what more authority they need to be supportive of broadband, what practices they've engaged in, historical or otherwise, that constrict what others outside the federal government can be doing. States should be doing the same thing. They should be emulating that process. And then I have to do this, of course, for my partner, Sean Stokes, who believes that everything in life can be related within 3 steps to pole attachments to address Blair's point that we need to do something about pole attachments. This is one area in which I fundamentally disagree with Blair and with the National Broadband Plan and with the FCC. Certainly we ought to be doing something about pole attachments, but it may not be what you might think. I would suggest that one problem with our pole attachment rules is they are exactly wrong in that the rules are cost-based, as they should be, but they don't let utilities recover their full costs. So if the issue is incenting faster, incenting more cooperation, why would you rush to lose money if you can't recover your costs? That's a fundamental fact, and economists would typically say if you want to encourage action, you have to offer some positive. Well, I'll pause at that point, and I understand we'll get a chance to dive more deeply into some of these points.